Good morning, and welcome to this Conservation Applied Research and Development, or CARD webinar, on the market potential for carbon and energy savings with load shifting. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Mary Sue Lobenstein, and I am the R&D Program Administrator at the Department of Commerce. And with me today is Adam Zoet, an Energy Planner at the Department of Commerce, where he coordinates analysis between the Conservation Improvement Program and other members of the Energy Regulation and Planning Unit. Adam also reviews Utility Conservation Improvement Program triennial plans and annual status reports, and is currently leading an effort to review Minnesota's cost-effectiveness tests. He is the project manager on the research that is the subject of this webinar, and he will moderate the Q&A portion of today's presentation. Our presenters today are Jeanette Lazaks and Maddie Kolbeck from Slipstream, and Robbie Vandergaan from the Center for Energy and Environment. As interim director of research and innovation at Slipstream, Jeanette's work focuses on developing and managing residential and commercial energy efficiency research planning projects. She applies technical research to examine how people use energy and combine skills in billing analysis, planning, and econometrics to identify energy impacts and opportunities. In addition to her work at Slipstream, she also serves as co-chair on the City of Madison Sustainability Madison Commission. Maddie is a research analyst at Slipstream, and in that role, she provides analytical support for projects relating to energy efficiency, market characterization and potential, and emerging technology. Maddie performs data analysis on energy cost, carbon savings, She also assists with secondary research and conducts surveys to better understand the current state of market and stakeholders' viewpoints. Robbie is research analyst at the Center for Energy and Environment, where he manages consulting projects with utility partners in the Midwest, and recently managed a non-wires alternative pilot in the St. Cloud area. He also assists other project leads with a variety of research planning and engagement projects in topic areas such as demand response, electric vehicles, and beneficial electrification. We're very pleased to have this team of researchers here today. Before we start, I'd like to point out that in the handout area of the control panel, you'll find some tips for reviewing the webinar today. You'll also find a link to a downloadable PDF of the slides under the same handouts section. You can submit questions to our presenters at any time using the questions pane. Simply type your questions and submit it. If there are questions that we don't get to before the end of the webinar, we will follow up with you. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available at a later date on both the department's and Slipstream's websites. The report based on this research will also be available at a later date. This webinar is one in an ongoing series that is designed to summarize the results from research projects funded by Minnesota's Applied Research and Development Fund, which was established in the Next Generation Energy Act of 2007. The purpose of this fund is to help Minnesota utilities achieve their energy savings goal. $2.6 million of this fund is set aside annually for the CARD program, which awards research grants in a competitive research or request for proposal process. Results from CARD projects provide utilities with the data that they use to enhance energy efficiency program designs in their SIP portfolios. As you can see by this pie chart, CARD projects to date have been in all building sectors, as well as some that cross multiple sectors. The subject of today's webinar is one of those that crosses multiple sectors and discusses the impact of load shifting measures on energy savings, costs, and emissions. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jeanette for today's presentation.
All right. Thank you, Mary Sue, for that great introduction. And I wanted to thank Minnesota CARD for supporting this exciting research. Also, this work couldn't have been completed without the hard work of a number of my own colleagues at Slipstream, as well as colleagues at the Center for Energy and the Environment and Raycon Energy. So today we'll be walking through the results of our study, which, as Mary Sue, will be published in a report later this year. We separate our results into two sections, And the reason for that, it will be a little more clear as we explain our methods. And we'll wrap up with some recommendations and hopefully leave enough time for plenty of questions that you can submit in that little chat bar. So let's get started with some background on our study goals and approach. So our goal in this research was to quantify the energy and energy costs and emissions impacts of measures that shift load with or without saving energy. So for a little bit of context around this research, we've seen increasing interest in load shifting across the country, and we wanted to look specifically at Minnesota to quantify the potential impact. And there are a few points to note. First off, as lighting and other basic efficiency measures reach saturation, utility energy programs need to fill the gap with more advanced and potentially more costly measures. Load shifting measures may offer a new opportunity for these programs. So additionally, as renewable energy increases, or renewable generation increases, the ability to shift the time of energy use is becoming increasingly important. So Minnesota's statewide electricity production is projected to be 50% renewable by 2035. And these load shifting measures can shift use to times when those resources are on the grid. This energy, of course, is low carbon, so ensuring that these technologies can be taken advantage of is important in our quest to reduce carbon emissions. So lastly, there's an overlap between energy efficiency and load shifting in many cases, meaning that some energy efficiency measures also load shift and vice versa. However, currently, regulators in Minnesota lack the geographic specific information needed to assess the system value of load shifting to kind of weigh those trade-offs. And that's where this research comes in. So we approached this study in 4 main steps. First, we selected a number of measures that represent a variety of load shifting effects. Using energy cost and emissions data collected and applying load shifting methods, we developed an hourly annual model, also kind of known as 8760 model, of energy costs and emissions for both present day and the future. I'm going to dive into each of these components in a little more detail now. So in terms of measure selection, we chose 14 measures that represent a variety of impacts on energy reduction and load shifting, and across a mix of customer segment types. We also categorized each of these measures based on the type of load shift, either an event-based demand reduction, a regularly occurring shift, or a pure energy efficiency measure with no shift. So an event-based demand reduction measure is one that sheds energy on select days at select hours. So for example, with this first one, smart thermostats and demand response control, a utility can call an event that reduces the cooling in a person's home for a set period of time. These events aren't typically called daily, but rather a number of times throughout the year. And more detail on that in a second. So this regularly occurring shift is one that can shift energy use in a consistent pattern each day. So for the phase change materials for space conditioning, for example, that first one, the system is set up such that the phase change material is used on a regular basis for a predetermined set of time. And I wanted to mention that these first 2 categories are similar to the shift and shed taxonomy introduced by Berkeley Lab a few years ago. But the key distinction here in our study is the frequency with which the demand change occurs. So either consistently across the year in these regularly occurring shifts, or for a handful of events throughout the year. And finally, the 2 energy efficiency measures here have no load shifting potential and save energy daily. Pretty straightforward. They were included to represent measures currently in the Minnesota efficiency program and efficiency programs across the country, really. So in the next few slides, we show you the definitions of each measure. Not going to bore you. I won't read them one by one, but they're here for your reference if you download the slides. But I do want to point out a few things. So for these event-based measures, like I mentioned, there's a called event for each measure. I want to point out that some of them actually have an efficiency component as part of them. So for example, the baseline for the air source heat pump. So the measure is the air source heat pump with a demand response control, but the baseline for that is an electric resistance heater. So while the event itself saves energy, so does the efficiency gains from going from a lower efficiency heater to a higher efficiency heater in the air source heat pump. And the implications of that will become clear in a little bit. So now these for regularly occurring shifts, I want to point out some innovative technologies that are commercially available, but maybe on more of the cutting edge, such as those phase change materials that I mentioned earlier. Those materials are melted and frozen around a set point to shift load in both conditioned and refrigerated spaces. They're also in this category of measures, there are some that are very controls based, like the electric vehicle charging that includes a managed control charging program, as well as refrigeration load control, which shifts the compressor runtimes without impacting food quality. All that is controls based. And finally, the two efficiency only measures are listed here, but pretty straightforward as measures go. So for each measure, we developed both an hourly baseline and measure load shape. So to collect the necessary data points for the development of those load shapes, we relied on a mixture of empirical data from technology field tests conducted by Slipstream and the Center for Energy and the Environment. Where empirical data was unavailable, and that was the case in quite a few measures, we use secondary data combined with Minnesota-specific assumptions and energy modeling to estimate hourly load shapes. So I want to mention this one part of our study, and I want to focus it on for a minute or two. So to create the comparable results across different types of measures, we scaled each measure to achieve peak savings of 500 kW kilowatts at some point in the year. This controls for the variability in the per unit demand impact across measures, so we can compare results across measures without having to worry about one measure having an outsized impacts on our model results simply due to the nature of the measure. So as an example, this graphic on the slides represents two measures, not real, they're just illustrative. One with a per unit demand savings of 50 kW and one with a per unit demand of 25 kW demand savings. So they both add up to 500 kW, but the total number of participants is 10 on the left and 20 on the right. But they both reach 500 kW demand savings for at least 1 hour throughout the year, and that's what we end up comparing in our results. This allows us to have a more apples-to-apples comparison across measures. So in our model and analysis, we had two levels of what we are calling optimizations that drove how the load shifting occurred: a price optimization and an emissions optimization. So we first optimize around price, and this is similar to how utilities currently promote demand response programs. So as high prices typically right now occur in the middle of the day, this corresponds to a shift of energy use away from the middle of the day. Regularly occurring shifts did this on a daily basis, while event-based shifts did this in the top 20 days in the year in our model. And the top 20 days in the year were identified looking through the prices from our data sets. So the emissions optimization, similarly, they looked at how the results may change when shifting load around the level of emissions. For regularly occurring shifts, we ran both a daytime and a nighttime scenario as the emission patterns change based on those time frames. The event-based shifts were modeled again to shed energy during the top emissions hours in the top 20 days of the year. And of course, the energy efficiency, they shed energy all day. So this slide kind of gives a graphical example of the regularly occurring shift measures, this one being the phase change materials for refrigeration. And here we see pretty clearly what's happening for the shifts. So baseline energy use is shown in blue, and the shifted energy use is shown in green. And you can see two regularly occurring shift scenarios, one which is avoiding energy overnight between the hours of 6 and 7, and one which is avoiding the energy during the day. and shifting that energy use to the night. And this slide shows an example of an event-based measure, the air source heat pump with demand response, the one I mentioned before. And here's where we can see graphically what's happening. So the baseline for this measure, as I mentioned, is the electric resistance heating and cooling. And the chart shows a reduction across the entire day. You can see the green line is a little bit, depending on the time of day, is always under the blue line. And that's due to the efficiency improvement from the air source heat pump. That additional dip in the middle of the day around hours kind of 12, 13, 14 represent the shed in energy use during the event hours. The graph also shows a slight recovery period where more energy is being used after the event, kind of a rebound. So finally, in terms of background and approach, I want to make note about our cost and emissions data sources. There are a number of levels of information that we use in our model. And we get into this in much more detail in our report. And you'll see where this comes into play in our results. But for our cost data, on the left side, we use current Midwest Independent Service Operator, MISO, market data for current day prices and fuel mix data. We tried, but were not successful in securing future data on the MISO market. We use statewide data for current and forecasted emissions, which includes EPA hourly emissions and known future retirements at the time of our research. And finally, we applied Excel Minnesota specific utility data for current and future costs and emissions, which was based on their integrated resources planning data. And I want to take a moment to extend a big thank you to Excel for working with us to provide these data because it really helps strengthen our results. So there's a lot more detail. I know I just went through a lot of detail, but there's a lot more detail in our report about other load shifting measures, about load shapes and assumptions. But in the interest of time, I'm going to pass the baton over to Maddie, who is going to go over some of our results.
Thanks, Jeanette. Before we dive into the results, I want to provide a few additional backgrounds about the price optimization scenario. So the general goal for price optimization was to shift load away from time periods with high cost towards time periods of low prices or low cost, which generally corresponded with shifting energy use away from the middle of the day and towards the middle of the night. We modeled all 14 of the measures in our study in this way, and we also modeled them against 3 different time periods in order to understand the differences we might expect to see in the future when the grid is a little cleaner and the generation mix may result in different price profiles. So this next slide shows an overview of what we found in our price optimization scenario. There's a lot to unpack in this graph, so let me walk you through it. We see the percent cost savings on the y-axis and the annual electricity savings on the x-axis. The colors represent the different type of measures. So we see demand response only in the light purple, energy efficiency only in light green, energy efficiency plus demand response in orange, and regularly occurring shift measures in dark green. For the purposes of illustration, we show different colors for the pure demand response measures and the energy efficiency plus demand response measures, as they have significantly different patterns from each other. I'll dive into the important results that this graph illustrates now. I want to start by directing our attention to the top right-hand corner of this graph. Here we see a cluster of measures that are either energy efficiency measures, like lighting efficiency or plug loads, or energy efficiency measures plus demand response, like air source heat pumps and heat pump water heaters. What this shows is that efficiency measures still largely dominate the percent cost savings, hitting the largest percent cost savings of all measures. And the other thing we see is that the electricity savings, seen on the x-axis, are really driving these high percent cost savings for these efficiency measures. Now let's shift our attention to the other cluster of measures. Here, this cluster in the lower left-hand corner includes pure demand response measures, as well as regularly occurring shift measures. The main takeaway here is that these measures lead to a vast range of percent cost savings and that they are not always directly related to energy savings. So here we're starting to see where the value of load shifting is coming in. For example, if we look at electric vehicle charging, we see that the measure saves no energy across the year, but that it has a higher percent cost savings than phase change materials for refrigeration, which we see saves around 800 megawatt hours per year. This is largely related to electric vehicles charging ability to shift load from high periods of time to low periods of time. Now let's break down this cluster a little farther. I wanted to zoom in on 3 measures that have an energy penalty, meaning that they use more energy throughout the year than they save. Although these 3 measures are highly clustered, they do have significantly different results. Industrial strategic energy management is able to have a small percent cost savings, while refrigeration load control is largely cost neutral, and thermal storage has a small but negative percent cost savings. This is again related to how well they're able to shift energy away from those high cost periods. From here, I'll dive into a couple of results about the specific measure categories. So this slide shows the same results, but in a little bit of a different format. So here we're still looking at the percent cost savings, but we're looking at the percent cost savings for only the 6 regularly occurring measures, and the annual energy savings are now displayed on the top of the bars. This graph shows that some of these measures save energy, some of these measures are energy neutral, and some of these measures have an energy penalty. One key takeaway is that electric vehicles have the highest percent cost savings. And like I mentioned earlier, this is particularly striking as electric vehicles are energy neutral, meaning they don't save any energy throughout the year. The primary reason for this, though, is that electric vehicle charging is able to shift all of its energy use from the top periods of the day, so from the middle of the day to the middle of the night when costs are lower. The rest of the measures have performance constraints that restrict their shifting to some ability. For example, if we look at phase change materials, which has the highest energy savings of any of these measures, we see that its percent cost savings is lower. The performance constraint there is that although the measure is able to freeze phase change materials during off-peak periods and then use those during on-peak periods to cool goods instead of using the refrigeration system, the freezing of the materials isn't enough for the entire peak period of the day, meaning that sometimes the refrigeration system still has to be on and there's some energy use during those peak periods. The next thing I wanted to point out was just again that some of these measures that have an energy penalty are able to save energy. So I pointed this out earlier, but again, we can see here that industrial strategic energy management has an energy penalty, but is saving energy, while refrigeration load control is mostly cost neutral and thermal storage is not able to overcome its energy penalty to create cost savings. This next graph shows a similar result, but for 4 of the 6 event-based measures in our study. So for the measures that have both an efficiency component and a demand response component, like Jeanette discussed earlier, we show both the efficiency component only in dark blue, as well as the efficiency plus demand response component in the green. The other 2 measures are purely demand response measures, and we show those in purple. The electricity savings are still on top of each of the bars. So what we really see here is that the measures that have both an efficiency and demand response component, the efficiency component eclipses any impact we see from demand response. And the main reason for this is that we see that each of these measures during their events have a pre-cooling or preheating period as well as a recovery period, and that eats into some of the electricity savings and cost savings that we would see from those events. When we look at the purely demand response measures, however, we see that they are able to generate significant cost savings. And the reason that they are is that they don't have to have a pre-use or a recovery period and are instead able to just shed energy use during the event and create more substantial savings. So that summarizes our energy cost results for the present day. In addition to energy costs, we also looked at the impact of these measures on capacity cost savings. So this graph is showing that capacity cost savings are generally defined as the delayed or deferment of the need to build a new power plant or new transmission and distribution. This graph shows just 5 of our measures, and these measures represent our various measure categories. What the graph shows is the percent of total cost savings that come from energy savings, that come from generation capacity savings, and that come from transmission and distribution capacity savings. It illustrates that purely demand response measures, such as network lighting, and load shifting measures, such as electric vehicle charging, have a significant amount of their cost savings coming from capacity savings. This is largely due to the fact that they're able to shed energy use at the peak very effectively and generate significant savings from that. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the other results from our price optimization, mostly in the interest of time, but I will say a few more things here. First of all, for our future model projections, we see that most measures have mostly stable percent cost savings across time. This is especially true for those measures with large energy savings across the year. The exception is regularly occurring shifts, which experience a decline in cost savings across time. And the reason for this is that we keep our shifting methodology the same for future years, meaning that we're still shifting energy use away from the middle of the day. But in future years, we start to see more renewables enter the grid, and prices in the middle of the day start to be lower than prices in the middle of the night. And so that erodes the percent cost savings that we see. However, if you change the shifting methodology, you should be able to get similar percent cost savings across time. The second thing I want to talk about are carbon emission savings. And here we also saw that most measures are able to save emissions compared to the baseline, even when we're optimizing on price. The main reason for this is that we see that carbon emissions are also lowest in the middle of the night, similar to how prices are. The exception to this are those measures that have an energy penalty, such as industrial strategic energy management, refrigeration load control, and thermal storage. And now, before we move on to the carbon emission sensitivity results, I wanted to highlight a few takeaways from our cost optimization analysis. So first of all, like we've talked about, energy efficiency dominates both cost and emission savings opportunities. The energy efficiency measures have the highest percent savings, and those measures with a load shifting and energy efficiency impact show that the energy efficiency savings dominate the results. However, we do see that load shifting measures can have a positive impact. They save both cost and emissions. And those measures with an energy penalty are also able to save cost through strategic shifting. Third, the timing of the shifts may need to change in the future to respond to changes in price profiles. We especially see this in 2034 as more renewables hit the grid and lower prices start to occur in the middle of the day. And lastly, capacity cost savings have a significant impact on total cost savings for demand response and shifting measures. Or in the reverse, we can think about it that demand response and shifting measures shave energy at peak times well and can generate significant cost savings for utilities. At this point, I will pass it over to Ravi to talk about our emission optimization results.
All right, thank you, Maddie. So rather than responding to price signals, the emissions optimization scenarios shift load away from time periods of higher carbon emissions and towards times of lower carbon emissions. While price and emissions are fairly correlated in the 2018 MISO market, this analysis allows us to examine the changing emissions dynamics of future years as the grid mix changes. The following results are for the selection of measures shown on this slide and are modeled across 3 time periods and 3 electric utility territories. This slide provides a comparison of these 3 timeframes and different utility footprints. First, a noticeable aspect is that current MISO marginal emissions are over double MISO average emissions and are much higher than the other utility footprints. In today's market, where MISO reports capacity reserves, coal is often the fuel on the margin, especially during low load hours. With coal plant retirements, however, this marginal value will decrease. Second, as anticipated, average emissions in Minnesota will decrease 60 to 70% between now and 2034. This reduction varies depending on which forecast is used because of the number of coal plant retirements and the fact that coal is a baseload fuel running for a high number of hours throughout the year. Finally, it is worth noting that in all years, Xcel Energy's emissions factor is lower than the statewide average, which is a result of its specific fuel mix. This chart is an example of an event-based measure run across each of the emission scenarios. The green bars represent the percentage of carbon dioxide savings through the replacement of the electric resistance baseline equipment that Jeanette mentioned, and the blue bars represent the efficiency and demand response carbon dioxide savings over the baseline. The heat pump event-based load shifting measure has the highest emission savings over the baseline out of all the measures in this study, which is a result of the energy savings from switching from electric resistance heating. Even so, the differences between these years is relatively small, ranging from 54% to 57% savings. Similar to the results from the energy price optimization scenario that Maddie covered, the incremental average emission savings from deploying demand response is negligible. This is because these demand response events happen only 20 times per year, and the length of time available to shift these thermal loads in a typical Minnesota home is only 2 to 3 hours, which does not provide significant emission savings, or changes rather. Compared to previous measures, this regularly occurring shift measure, electric vehicle charging, shows the highest degree of variation of CO2 savings based on emissions footprint and year. This is because shifting EV charging times does not save energy, as Maddie mentioned, so all the carbon dioxide savings come from time of day emissions variations. There are a couple of interesting takeaways to point out for the electric vehicle charging results. First, nighttime charging provides higher emissions benefits than daytime charging with 2 exceptions: the current MISO marginal emissions and the 2034 statewide emissions profile, which are circled or are boxed in red. This is for 2 very different reasons. In 2018, a large portion of MISO's nighttime marginal emissions are from must-run coal plants. And looking forward to 2034, daytime charging savings are a result of high solar penetration during the day, illustrating a potential need for more workplace charging infrastructure. And finally, these results also demonstrate that emissions patterns may vary utility by utility. In 2034, our statewide emissions forecast favors daytime charging, whereas Xcel Energy shows higher carbon savings when load is shifted to nighttime charging. In terms of takeaways, it really depends on what grid region is chosen to demonstrate carbon savings. Currently, there is not a significant difference in average emission savings, whether optimizing on price or emissions. With that said, there is a difference in marginal emissions. In the current grid mix, shifting usage to the daytime saves more emissions but has a negative impact on prices. Marginal daytime emissions are lower right now, mostly due to natural gas generation. Nighttime emissions are higher because of must-run coal plants. And now I'll turn the presentation back over to Maddie for high-level takeaways for the project.
Great, thanks, Robbie. So that brings us to our key set of recommendations for integrating these measures into programs as well as for future research on this topic. The first three recommendations are program recommendations that work to accelerate load shifting behavior. The first is to integrate measures that shift load and save energy into SIP portfolios. Measures like phase change materials for refrigeration both save energy and shift load, generating multiple benefits and fitting within the current regulatory framework in Minnesota. The second recommendation is to bundle load shifting measures into portfolios to create energy saving opportunities. Our results show that there is ample opportunity to save carbon and money from these measures and that they should be pursued. The third recommendation is to consider future rate designs that incentivize customers to shift energy when the system is near capacity. Although our study did not explicitly look at the impact of rate design, vast research exists that shows that rate design does influence customer behavior and shifting. In the future, these rates could reflect carbon and encourage customers to shift energy use away from high carbon times. The second set of recommendations is also a set of program recommendations. The first recommendation is to apply a utility-specific grid region to calculate emissions benefits where available. This would allow a utility to calculate its benefits using the renewable energy dynamics that are specific to its portfolio. The second recommendation is to further investigate measures that shift load to nighttime hours, absent any energy saving benefits in the near term. Depending on the baseline assumptions, there is a chance that these measures will increase marginal emissions in the short term due to the current generation mix in the MISO North region. The last recommendation on this slide is to explore additional measures that may offer similar load shifting benefits. Our study looked at a select set of measures that have these load shifting capabilities, but there are many other measures that offer similar benefits, such as retrocommissioning with a specific focus on load shifting. The last set of recommendations are for future research on this topic. The first is that researchers should include the time-varying benefits of these measures in any future demand-side management potential study. The second future research recommendation is to continue to perform field research on load shifting measures to generate a more robust data set of empirical load shapes. We found in our study that the availability of data is still lacking for a lot of these measures, and especially data that is specific to the Midwest region. Additional research in this area will help with future studies on load shifting impacts and how they will ultimately influence the grid. And the third recommendation for future research is to conduct additional research to improve marginal emission, energy cost, and capacity cost forecast. The values used in this study are relatively uncertain, and they can have a large influence on the impact that these measures have on the grid. So future research on these subjects will help our understanding on the impact these measures have in the future on the grid. And at this time, I want to thank you all so much for your time and for listening to our presentation, and I'll pass it back over to Mary Sue.
Great. Thank you all for that great presentation. If you have not already done so, please type any additional questions you have into the Q&A panel and send them directly to us. Adam, do you have any questions for Jeanette, Maddie, or Robbie?
Yeah, looks like a lot of questions have already come in.
Great.
So some questions, yeah, came in when you were going over the background about the types of measures that were included in the study. So one of the questions was, what kind of data is considered secondary data, and where did this data come from for the study?
Sorry, trying to get my mute button. That's a great question. I should mention, we have a lot of detail about all of the assumptions used in the study in our report, our forthcoming report. An example, there's a couple examples I'll point out just to give an idea. So we at Slipstream have done plug load research. We did actually a previous card grant where we have Minnesota specific data on plug load load shapes, and we were able to pull that data right in to our energy model, or sorry, 8760 model. Another example of secondary data could be the refrigeration load control, which is an interesting one. And Maddie, you can weigh in on other interesting ones. But that's where we work directly with a manufacturer or kind of a technology provider for refrigeration load control. And they helped us get data that was not from Minnesota, where we changed some assumptions to create a model that would be specific to Minnesota. And so those are kind of the two ends of the spectrum that I can think of, where we have very, like I would say, very solid primary data that we've collected, and then others is relying on other people's data to create that. And then there's a couple like maybe in between where we've created energy models, which also include secondary data. Maddie, do you have anything, or Robbie, do you have anything to add on that?
I would say that covers it. And like Jeanette said, each measure has detailed assumptions listed in the report.
Right, and where we got the data.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Good. Another question about measures. Which demand side measures can most effectively deliver peak demand savings during the winter?
That's a good one. Maddie, do you want to take this on? Or
Sure, yeah, I can start and you can jump in. One measure that I would point out is air source heat pumps that can really reduce peak demand in the winter. It has a large heating component, and so that was one of the measures that was very heavily favored in the winter. And I would say that's probably the top one. Jeanette or Robbie, I don't know if you have other ones to add.
I might just layer on to your comment that air source heat pumps can provide peak demand savings in the winter, and then especially more so if they're combined with a weatherization component to the home. That will further reduce the winter peak demand. And then I would maybe say that electric vehicles can offer that resource anytime during the year as well.
Right, and we have several measures that work across the year. Other ones include the lighting measures and some of the critical peak pricing even we saw occurring sometimes in the winter.
Yeah.
Excellent. One question about lighting. So how do you load shift lighting? Are you considering demand response to be load shifting? And then this person thought demand response was load shed, not load shift.
Jeanette, do you want me to take that one? I'm happy
Sure.
to. So this is where Jeanette mentioned a little bit about how our terminology doesn't always match up one-to-one with some of the common terminology. So we do recognize that demand response measures such as lighting are often referred to as shed measures, and we're referring to those just more generally that these are all of our shifting measures, meaning they're changing energy in one way or the other. in response to the exact question about lighting, the way that our lighting measure worked was that during certain hours of the day when an event was called, the lighting would be adjusted by either tuning or occupancy to reduce the energy used from lighting during that time period. And so that's kind of how the lighting measure was working as a shed measure.
And then I would add that we had a lot of discussion about whether we should match the shed and shift taxonomy, but we realized for our study we really wanted to focus on some of the nuances of the regularly occurring shifts and the kind of called events. And then I also want to add just that the lighting control is another example of where we had empirical data from Slipstream's research. So.
A couple questions about air source heat pumps. Did your definitions of air source heat pump measures include the air source heat pump plus envelope efficiency improvements?
Robbie, do you want to take that? Or I'm happy to. So
sure, I'm happy to give it a go, and you can jump in if needed. But yeah, so we looked at both air source heat pumps compared to the baseline of electric resistance, as well as air source heat pumps combined with a weatherization component or deep energy retrofit compared to the electric baseline equipment. So we actually looked at both in that regard. And I don't know, Jeanette or Maddie, if you want to add on anything there.
No, I think that's a great question. I think we actually in the beginning thought whether we would want that as one measure, but we felt like it was an interesting enough measure to tease it out to see where the efficiency component is a little bit stronger, where you have that deep energy retrofit. So we decided to actually make it two separate measures. So yeah, that's what I'll add.
Okay. Let's see. And so do the savings from air source heat pumps in this study include electrification from natural gas?
No, it didn't. Yeah, we didn't do any fuel switching in the study. We stayed away from that. We looked at electric measures that really affected the electric grid, and we did not. That's one of the reasons also why we want to highlight that the baseline for that air source heat pump is the electric resistance heater. We didn't look at any fuel switching at all. Although I think, it's an interesting question when you're talking about maybe adding more electrification and changing heating sources from natural gas to electricity. It's one that it was out of the scope of this study, but I think it's an interesting question when you think about adding more of that load. I don't know if Robbie or Maddie want to add anything.
I
No,
agree.
I think that covers it. Yeah.
Completely agree.
Sounds good. So question about emissions. Did you or can you use hourly marginal emissions rates rather than day versus night? This person said that the EPA advert tool would enable estimation on a regional based on historical dispatch, but not future. And he thought that Excel might have finer hourly data available.
Yeah, so we did use hourly data for all of our emissions modeling as well as our price modeling. So the statewide emissions analysis actually used a very similar method to AVERT, but it was looking at the statewide level instead of having to go to the entire region. And it did look into the future by taking into account future retirement dates for most utilities in the state. So just to clarify, all of our modeling was done at the hourly level.
Yeah, this might, is it maybe Robbie, I thought maybe you wanted to mention something about the Coal Creek. There are, the emissions didn't include the most recent announcements, and I'll let you expand on
That's right.
that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so for the statewide emissions footprint profile, after we've had gone through our modeling exercise, there was a pretty big announcement from Great River Energy that they would be retiring their Coal Creek station in North Dakota, which solely is dedicated to serve Great River Energy customers in Minnesota through a high voltage line that they have running back over interstate boundaries. And they're planning on replacing this generation with about 1.1 gigawatts of wind energy, some natural gas for another power plant, and then also doing an experiment with a long duration battery demonstration system. So that will change the forecast that was assumed in the model, and probably in a favorable way, and definitely in terms of emissions, and then it will also have impacts on price as well.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, this kind of research is every month something changes. So, you know, that retirement was announced after we had done a good portion of our work. And we expect, you know, in the future that similar announcements and, you know, our results would change in the future based on some of that, some of the future announcements that we continue to hear about coal plant retirements.
Yeah, speaking of data forecasts and changing data, one question was, are you using commission-approved IRPs for Excel, or are you using the proposed IRP that's still under consideration for Excel? And this person also had a follow-up question that the EV scenario indicated there would be more solar charging in non-Excel utilities, but this person thought that Excel is the only utility proposing a substantive amount of solar, and why would there be that disconnect?
I'll take the first part of the question. So in terms of integrated resource plans or IRPs, our model uses the approved IRPs, so not the proposed that have not yet been approved. And then I might see if Jeanette or Maddie might have something to add there on the second part.
So I would maybe benefit from hearing it again, and in terms of the solar part. I'm not sure.
Yeah, he was wondering, the EV scenario indicated there would be more solar charging in non-Excel utilities, but this person thought that Excel is the only utility proposing a significant amount of solar, and why would there be like a disconnect there?
I think I'm following. So in 2034, we see that.
Would it be helpful to go back to that? Would it be helpful to go back to that slide?
Perhaps.
Okay.
In 2034, we see that the statewide emissions, the daytime charging is favored. And for Excel, we see that nighttime charging is still favored. So the question is, why is there that disconnect, especially because Excel has more solar? And my hypothesis is that Excel is forecasting wind energy as well, and so the interplay between wind and solar is probably affecting these models quite significantly, and Excel might be modeling that slightly differently than what our statewide model did. I don't know if Jeanette or Robbie, you have any more detail, but I don't think that is something that we have a super concrete answer to. It's more just a hypothesis that it's about the interaction of wind and solar.
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation and theory. And my colleague Josh Quinnell is not on this call today, and he's done quite extensive work on the statewide emissions model. So if there are detailed questions like this one that anyone would like follow up with, we'd be happy to pass those along too, and we can dig into some of those.
Yeah, and I think the only thing that I would add, just to add on to what Maddie mentioned, is that I don't think we have the kind of detail that would know exactly what is going into Excel's forecast in terms of what, I think there's a lot of unknowns here. But if there are additional questions, Robbie, that's a great segue, is that, you know, if there's additional questions that we haven't answered, even as we answer them here, feel free to follow up. I'll just pull up our contact slide again. So.
Sounds good. Yeah, we actually have about 7 questions come in that we haven't gotten to, but I see that we're 5 minutes away from our time on the webinar. So yeah, maybe following up on some of these offline would be good. Just one more question, I think. So what would you say is the single most important takeaway from the results of this study?
From my perspective, I think that this study, it aligns with other research that's happening across the country, and it's showing that load shifting does have a benefit across a number of measures, and even those load shifting measures that are pure load shifting. There's pure load shifting measures, but then there's also load shifting measures that have an efficiency component. I think our study shows that there's a value to all of those, and probably, you know, as Maddie went through our recommendations, would benefit kind of exploring more in terms of how regulatory structures could address some of kind of promoting the benefits or weighing those benefits and costs. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts in terms of Maddie or Ravi in terms of your biggest takeaway.
I was going to say similar things to you. So I would largely agree that the biggest takeaway is that these measures do have a positive impact on both costs and emissions, and that you know, those shifting methodologies just need to be continued to be explored in the future to be getting the most benefits you can out of these measures.
Yeah, I would say. Oh, go ahead, Ravi.
I don't think this this concludes any sort of finality or has any sort of this work is not over. As you've both have pointed out, this needs more research in terms of load shapes that are appropriate to the region, and then also it depends on which data is being used to inform these results. So I think it's a call for future work, and since this is such an important issue of capturing renewable energy through these measures, it does beg the question, or it does illustrate that we need more focus on this.
That's a great response as well. Yeah.
Thank you all. I'll kick it back to Mary Sue.
Great. Thanks, Adam. Thanks all. Again, if you have follow-up questions, as Jeanette says, please feel free to contact one of us. And this recording of this webinar and slide set will be available on the department's website as well as on Slipstream's website in a few weeks. And the final report will be available in a couple of months. When available, you can link to either of these from the quick links on our Applied Research and Development webpage, which is indicated on this slide. And the R&D page has additional resources and information related to CARD program and to CARD research projects, which you can check out by going to the address at the bottom of this slide. Thanks for participating again today, and we appreciate your interest in CARD projects. Before we leave, I want to take this opportunity to mention some upcoming December webinars. On December 4th, the Center for Energy and Environment will talk about the results from their investigation of evolving residential cooling systems and loads in Minnesota. On the 10th of December, the Center for Energy and Environment will be back to present data they've gathered about the medium and large commercial and industrial refrigeration market in Minnesota. And then our last webinar of the year will be on December 16th, in which 2050 partners will discuss results from an 18-month process to develop a roadmap for a Minnesota Codes and Standards program. You can keep abreast of upcoming webinars and other news related to the Minnesota Conservation Improvement Program by signing up for the SIP updates on our mail list. You can link to that using the link on the slide here. In the meantime, please feel free to contact me if you have questions, feedback, or suggestions for either the CARD program or CARD webinars. And thanks again for participating today. As a reminder, there will be an evaluation that launches after the conclusion of this webinar. Please be sure to take some time and fill out that survey and provide us with feedback. That'll be much appreciated. Thank you and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.